Okay, I'm Dave Webster and I'm sat here with my colleague Dr. Martin Wood here at the University of Gloucestershire, and we've been talking about Buddhism in various contexts. We often hear a term for a type of Buddhism bandied about in discussion, which is Mahayana Buddhism. Martin, what does Mahayana Buddhism mean? What is it?
Sanskritically, it's translated as the great vehicle, but I'm not going to suggest to you that it is a specific form of Buddhism. Far from it. What I'm going to suggest is that it's not a schism, it's not a disagreement, it is a movement, it's a development in Buddhism, which is a very important thing to understand. And it embraces a number of Buddhist schools which have sought to reinterpret the fundamental religious ideas which were put forward in the Abhidharma. So I think it's important to note that its development came out of India, it moved north up into places like Tibet, into Mongolia, across into China, and as a consequence into places like Japan, Korea, etc. There is virtually no evidence of its existence prior to the 2nd century CE, but largely I think it would be pertinent to suggest that the movement began to crystallise and incorporate teachings of existing schools. And there's a great emphasis I feel we need to place a great emphasis on that understanding that it isn't a specific religion, that it is actually a movement and a conglomeration of various ideas and a development.
And although we won't go into it, I think people who study the later Theravada and early Buddhist traditions generally talk about various groupings within that tradition that may have led to this emergence of Mahasangikas and various other traditions. And so they pointed not as being a mighty schism, in the sense you put it, but an evolutionary change. And part of that evolution is about its geographical mobility. It moves. Part of it is time and change and things like that. Part of it, as we perhaps won't discuss in detail, is to do with a new set of literature, the second turning of the Dharma wheel.
Yeah, I'm just going to suggest that there isn't specifically a canonical emphasis in the same way that there would be with the Pali text.
No, absolutely. You have this much more liberal, open set of new evolving literature, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra and things of this sort. But also, the thing that I really wanted to kind of quiz you on really is that one thing that typifies these divergent Mahayana schools is that there's a move forward in the set of values they're interested in. So how would you typify the value preoccupations that dominate the Mahayanas? What are they interested in?
It seems to me that there are 3 sections that they're mostly interested in. You've got the compassion, you have the meditation, and then you have the wisdom. Now, this is something which is really interesting. The member of a Mahayana tradition would be of service to others. The whole thing of service to others is the most important thing, and I think that's in direct contrast on a surface level to the Arhat and his particular preoccupation with personal salvation. Something you're going to talk about hopefully later on, the Bodhisattva is much more concerned with a universal salvation. And I think that is very, very much interlinked with the whole idea of wisdom, but also it begs the question, which comes first, wisdom or ethics? The ethical position based on compassion, or the wisdom that leads to that particular?
I mean, absolutely, and I think it's very easy at a surface level, you talked about a surface, superficial level, to draw an easy contrast and say, in early Buddhism, which leads to the Theravada and other similar traditions, over time, wisdom becomes more and more important, and compassion gets a bit edged out. Richard Gombrich writes about that in a little yellow book called about early Buddhism, how Buddhism began, about how insight worsted compassion in the Pali texts. So at one level you can say they get preoccupied with wisdom with the Abhidharma texts, and compassion comes a second. And the Mahayana tradition is saying, whoa, compassion's first, other people are first, caring's first. And that kind of reorientation of values is, for many people, and certainly when I think about Mahayana, I don't so much think about the philosophical depth, although that's really a key part of it. I want to think about compassion and this reorientation of the religion back to, as sometimes it's portrayed, the notion of caring about others coming first. And it's that conversation about which comes first is, I think for many people, quite interesting. Of course, the more you look at it, the more complicated it gets, but from the surface view, you can draw quite a nice contrast.
And speaking about complications, the whole idea of sunyata as an underpinning for compassion, I think is very, very important. And one of the key doctrines, it strikes me, in the Mahayana tradition is this doctrine of emptiness coming to prominence in Mahayana thought. that surely has to have some kind of interplay with compassion.
Yes. Just thinking about the complexity we can encounter with this, but Sunyata, absolutely, this notion of emptiness. And on one level, people think, well, this key idea that the Mahayana develops in certain traditions, emptiness, seems, how would that support compassion? Surely compassion is based on divine love for your perfect soul and things. But actually, emptiness can be read differently as a way of saying that nobody is intrinsically bad.
Exactly.
We all have the kind of transformative potential for radical change. Anybody, no matter how good or bad at the moment, can become anything, and therefore we have a kind of freedom, what a European philosopher might describe as a radical freedom, to become anything. So that sets up the kind of ethical questions in a different framework.
And also, because we have that emptiness, that shared emptiness, also we're susceptible to the same frailties and the same misconceptions and the same misinterpretations of reality.
Oh, absolutely. We're all prone to that. So this emptiness is a kind of both puts us in a kind of solidarity with each other, with all living beings, but also puts us in a solidarity of potential. So we can all do things.
And that notion of solidarity is something that underpins a bodhisattva. Could you expand on that?
There is this term, the bodhisattva, which is linguistically bodhi, awakening, and sat is a kind of being. So it's a being for awakening. And rather than take the vow or the undertaking to become individually enlightened, many Mahayana Buddhists taking the bodhisattva vow to become like a Buddha, but not to achieve a final nirvana till every other living being has attained it. So they hold back from final exit from the world of suffering in order to help others. So it's that is seen as profoundly foregrounding compassion. It puts caring for others first before your own personal salvation. And it's symbolically very important. It's also philosophically quite important because it brings in the idea that anybody can become a Buddha. We all have, as some Buddhist traditions and Mahayana describe it, we all have the Buddha nature within us. And that's another way of talking about emptiness, but it's emptiness in a positive light. It's so saying, you, with all your faults and endless things wrong with you, you have just as much possibility of becoming a Buddha as somebody kind and compassionate and wise like me. So we all have those kind of potentials. So Buddha nature is a way of framing that. So the Bodhisattva is this different kind of goal that emerges in Mahayana Buddhism and gives us this, we all could achieve supreme eternal Buddhahood, but we hold back from doing so to help the rest of kind of the living species of sentient beings attain it as well. That's a very different vision.
Yeah, of course. Almost revolutionary. I mean, I would suggest that actually the Mahayana movement is as important in the development of Buddhism as the Bhakti tradition is in Hinduism, in that it actually brings around a profound shift in consciousness to an extent, and also in motivation and the final goal and how you look at the final goal. And would I be right in suggesting that bodhisattva notion is actually something which is reinterpreted to an extent throughout the Mahayana world, as it were? So there is an understanding of this Buddha nature in Pure Land, in Chan, in Zen, etc.
Absolutely, and although it finds its expression differently in those traditions, because those traditions are geographically distinct, they're culturally distinct, they have happened at different times, they share enough features to see themselves as part of the Mahayana family. So Mahayana, as you started out by saying, isn't one sort of Buddhism which is really strictly, it's a family resemblance between a set of sorts of Buddhism. So these forms of Buddhism did evolve from this flowering of literature around the 2nd century CE and beyond. And they all share a certain orientation. They have these features that make us think, okay, so Pure Land Buddhism is quite different from Zen Buddhism.
Of course, yeah.
But nonetheless, they are interested in the notion of emptiness, of transformation, of the idea of the potential of Buddhahood. And that marks them out quite distinctly from the Theravada tradition.
So we should eschew any tendency towards homogenizing Buddhism as a whole.
It's really tempting, to talk about general things in Buddhism, but we should be really careful. And I think actually for students who have to write about it and do assessments on it and things, I think demonstrating your awareness of diversity, even if you can't remember the names of the traditions, saying there are lots of different traditions and they vary on this, and if you can name some of them, is going to do you a lot of favours.
Exactly. But also the other question is, would the Buddha of Sri Lanka recognise the Buddha of Japan, which is another, another
Absolutely,
issue. Absolutely, yeah. Just to get onto the synoptic criticisms here, that's the whole idea of shunyata, of emptiness, is an interesting one. However, it has been posited that this basically accentuates formlessness, but leads to a form of, how can I put it, philosophical nihilism. And radical ethical relativism of Nietzsche's beyond good and evil. Ethical language, Mackie.
Well, absolutely.
Moral error. Does it really correspond to anything?
Well,
this is what we're trying to get
personally,
at. Yeah.
my view would be that actually there isn't any ethical nihilism in Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil.
Right.
I would read it quite differently and argue that he's arguing against nihilism, against the possibility of the danger of a European nihilism. But switching back to Buddhism for a minute, there is that danger, and there is a danger, and I think it has happened in the history of Mahayana Buddhism, of the idea of two levels of truth, of things that are only true at a lower level, and therefore a higher being can break moral laws because they can see there's real danger there. There's real danger of the abuse of that, and the idea of skillful means that you can break moral rules for the moral good. You see the example of that with a burning house.
Indeed.
You will lie to the child on the top floor and say, yes, jump out, we've got sweets, or there's members of One Direction here, whatever will make them jump out to come and leave the house, even though it's a lie, because it saves their life. They won't jump, but if you lie to them, they will jump. You've just saved them from burning to death. Surely that's worth a little lie. That kind of ethical thinking that you find in Mahayana seems fine when you start thinking about what is the greater good. We've just, now in the 21st century, the 20th century is dominated by murder and genocide on the grounds of the greater good, and people are suspicious of that for good reasons.
Indeed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Excellent.